Despite its continuing popularity for such a long time, there's surprisingly a lack of folklore about cider beyond fairy legends, the custom of wassailing and the apple tree man. But despite this, we're going to go and have a look at these snippets of cider folklore in this week's episode of Fabulous Folklore. Hello there and welcome to Fabulous Folklore, the podcast for all things folklore, occult and just a bit weird. I'm your host Icy Sedgwick, blogger, fantasy author and your guide into these rather mysterious realms. I've got some rare things to show you, so come on in, take a look around, but be careful not to touch anything. These things sometimes bite. Well, hello there and welcome back to Fabulous Folklore with me, your host Icy Sedgwick. We are finishing the Folklore of Drinks theme with cider folklore this week, and it's been quite an interesting one to research because there wasn't actually a huge amount to have a look at, surprisingly. Like, there's a lot on one specific custom, but then there isn't really a huge amount for anything else. But there is quite a lot of variations in that one custom, so there is still plenty for us to dig into. And I am just going to jump straight into it without much of a preamble, other than to say that if you're listening to this on Saturday, April 30th, happy Walpurgisnacht, happy St. Walpurgis Eve, depending on which way you look at it, or happy Beltane. If you are interested in any of those things, then I have got an exclusive episode specifically on them for Patreon supporters. So if you are interested in hearing that, then you can get access to it at the £3.50 a month or higher tier on Patreon, and the link is in the show notes below. But anyway, let's get on with cider. Now, cider does have a pretty long history, especially here in Britain. And when the Romans arrived, they discovered that the locals were drinking a beverage made from apples. Now, it wasn't quite cider as we'd recognise it yet, and nobody actually knows how long that drink existed prior to this point. Cider did then spread across the Roman Empire, and Charlemagne even references it, thus confirming its popularity in Europe. The Normans then imported the idea of apple orchards and even the word cider back into Britain during the Norman conquest of 1066. Now, cider became an important industry in the medieval period, with monasteries making their own cider to sell. And its popularity largely peaked in the mid-17th century, and agricultural changes saw it go into decline. But it has had something of a resurgence in recent years. And as I said in the introduction, there's surprisingly not a huge amount of cider folklore in the way that there is stuff around tea and coffee. And there are, as I say, a couple of fairy legends that we're going to have a look at. And there's the custom of wassailing, which more than makes up for it. And then there's also the apple tree man as well. Now, I'm not going to be focusing on folklore related to apples specifically because of the fact that obviously that's a food, not a drink. But I will come back to that at some point in the future when we do like the folklore of food, because it would be rude not to. So we are going to just stick to cider for this episode. Now, for our first story, we are going to go to a legend that's from the village of St. Breavils in Gloucestershire, and this concerns cider and fairies. And here, a farmer named John Jones lived in the area. A bad year left him struggling to pay the rent, and selling cider seemed the best way for him to earn something to be able to then pay this rent. So he had this decision, you know what, I'm going to go and sell this cider. And as soon as he left the house to go and see if anybody wanted to buy it from him, a man appeared asking if he was selling cider. Jones couldn't believe his luck because he's like, yes, of course I'm selling cider. So he said yes, and then they settled on a price. And then the man gave him some somewhat strange instructions because he asked him to take a hogshead of cider up to the big meadow. There he would find a fairy ring, and he should pour the cider onto the grass inside the ring. The man paid and left. Now, Jones thought that that was a bit of a waste of good cider, and even though he'd been paid for it, he decided that he would take a hogshead of water up to the ring that evening and pour that onto the grass, because as he reckoned, how would the fairies know the difference? Just as he stepped out of the ring, having poured the water onto the grass, he came face to face with his now irate buyer. The man cursed Jones and his family that they would be cursed until they lost as much blood as he'd poured water into the ring, because obviously he had just cheated them. And as the story goes, the family ended up with various stories in which members bled to death. Now, the definitions for the size of a hogshead do vary, and I couldn't really find a standard one, but the Collins Dictionary gives one in which it's either 238 litres or 63 gallons. Now, bear in mind the adult human body has around 5 litres of blood. Based on that, you're looking at essentially 47 people bleeding to death and one lucky individual only losing 3 litres of blood. So basically, don't try to cheat the fair folk, people. It's a good rule to live by. It could explain why, and I quote, as late as 1930 at least, haymakers in North Devon would remember to throw a crumb or two of their lunch and a drop of their cider on the ground, end quote, because apparently this appeased the local pixies. So if ever you are asked for cider by the fairies, or indeed you want to leave an offering, then cider in Devon in particular is a good way to go. But obviously the big thing that comes up when you Google cider and folklore, or indeed look at any of the books, is wassailing. And there are two types of wassailing in the English calendar, and there's one in which people go door to door and it's very much like carol singing, and then there's the other one in which people visit orchards to ensure the health of the apple harvest in the coming year, and it's the latter type that we're going to explore here. And J.R. Wiley describes the custom of wassailing as being Saxon in origin, and that's basically the custom in general. He doesn't really specify which one. But the term apparently comes from wes, which means be, and hail, which means whole, which ultimately means be of good health. And the visiting houses custom apparently happens on 5th of January, while visiting the apple trees happens on 17th of January, although they do sometimes move or change date as well, depending on where you are. Now, no one knows where the idea of apple wassailing actually comes from, and obviously there are some people who, as with everything, insist it's an ancient pagan rite, but the first record seems to date to around 1585, although I did find another version where it was actually sometime in the 15th century, but either way it's quite clearly not pre-Christian in terms of what's recorded. Now, that doesn't mean that there aren't earlier records, those earlier records just haven't been found yet, so it is possible that it is actually older than that. But the general rite takes the following format. People go to the orchard on 17th of January and they either select the best or the oldest tree, or indeed sometimes it's the tree that actually has the best apples, or indeed they also visit each of the trees in turn. It really does depend where you are. The people might sing to the tree because there is a specific wassailing song, or they might dance around it, and then they each then have a drink of some cider before pouring the cider onto the tree's roots from the wassail bowl. Then people would make a lot of noise, often by firing guns, to frighten away evil spirits. And then the final step involves putting toast in the tree's branches as an offering to the good spirits. And this toast might be soaked in cider first, and some think that the good spirits took the form of birds, hence the toast, so the toast then becomes an offering for them. And in some customs, wassailers do visit every apple in the orchard, but people actually stopped doing it in Dunster after the men accidentally wassailed a pear tree as well. E.F. Coote Lake actually reported on a wassailing ceremony in Carhampton in 1959, and people had been wassailing in the orchard beside the 300-year-old Butcher's Arms Inn for generations. And on January 17th, up to 200 people gathered for the wassailing, which was actually broadcast live by the BBC. And the licensee of the pub, Eric Tarr, provided buckets of hot cider laced with ginger to toast the tree's health. Now, January 17th in this case marked Old Twelfth Night, and the custom at Carhampton had actually had a revival in the 1920s after attendance dropped, and then this was another form of revival at the end of the 50s. Now, during the ceremony, the attendees wished the trees good health before singing the apple tree wassail song, and then 3 men fired guns among the tree branches to scare away evil spirits. And at that point, people then soaked their toast in cider and then hung that among the boughs as an offering to the good spirits. And in 1971, the following song was then collected from Tar in Carhampton. Old apple tree, we wassail thee, and hoping thou would bear, for the Lord doth know where we shall be till apples come another year. For to bear well and to bloom well, so merry let us be. Let every man take off his hat and shout at the old apple tree. Old apple tree, we wassail thee, and hoping thou would bear, hats fulls, caps fulls, 3 bushel bags fulls, and a little heap under the stairs. Hip hip hooray. Now, naturally, the wassailing custom actually appears in different variations around those parts of the country famous for apple orchards. So it's seen near Ilminster, the people would pour cider on the roots of the tree that provided the most apples, which saved wassailing all the trees in the orchard. And in Crowcombe, a boy would put the toast in the branches of the best or oldest tree, and then again, once everyone had drunk from the cider cup, the rest was then poured around the tree's roots. And in Curry Revell and Drayton, which are neighbouring villages near Langport, people also went on to wassail the most important inhabitants of the village after wassailing the trees. And they did theirs on January the 5th, which is the old Christmas Eve in the folk calendar. So here we see the conflation of the two types of wassailing custom. And in another variation, people would actually dip the lowest branches in cider, and then everyone present would bow 3 times. And on the third bough, everyone would raise up as if they were bearing something really heavy, and it's believed this was a form of sympathetic magic to tell the tree it should produce a heavy load of apples, and they were then miming this to demonstrate what they meant. And another version of the Somerset Wassailing song runs thus. Wassail, wassail, all round the town, our cupboard is white, our ale it is brown, our bowl is made from the good old ash tree, so now my brave fellows, let's drink unto thee. And it's amazing how many times you hear that the wassail bowl is made from ash, so there's that lovely little link back to ash trees. Now, one of the reasons behind wassailing may be its use of sympathetic magic. So essentially you provide an offering of cider to get more apples, which are obviously cider's raw ingredient, in the next harvest. Or indeed it may be a remnant of a rite to appease the local land spirits. And incidentally, if you're interested in land spirits, I do have a bonus episode of Fabulous Folklore available to Patreon supporters at the £3.50 a month tier as well. But all of this could tie in with the stories of the apple tree man. So in Somerset, an orchard's oldest apple tree is referred to as the apple tree man, and according to Catherine Biggs, the orchard's fertility actually depends on this spirit. And Ruth Tongue collected tales about the apple tree man in Somerset, which is obviously famous for its cider. And in one of the stories, a man who didn't have enough money to pay his rent then offered his last mug of cider to the orchard trees on Christmas Eve. And then the apple tree man appeared and rewarded him by showing him where he would find enough buried gold to pay the rent. And in another tale, a tortoiseshell cat used to go wandering in the woods at night, but one New Year's Eve, the apple tree man actually stopped her from going into the orchard. He didn't want her around the people coming wassailing because they'd be shooting guns to scare away the witches. So he told her to go home and not to go wandering again at night until St. Tib's Eve. So this lovely little cat never wandered at night again because she didn't know when St. Tib's Eve was. And as the story pointed out, nor do anybody else. Now obviously this wouldn't be a Fabulous Folklore post without some mention of medicinal uses, and surprisingly I couldn't find that many medicinal uses of cider, and it doesn't necessarily seem as common as you would think. But people did sometimes use cider that was turning to vinegar to treat muscle sprains even as recently as the first half of the 20th century, while in Dorset people gave a mixture of marigold tea and cider to those with measles. Although where it does appear in remedies is apple cider vinegar form, and it appears in a whole range of remedies to do with everything from cleaning your house to medicinal things as well. And obviously apple cider vinegar is a very impressive preservative used to pickle food. You can also get rid of foot odour by mixing apple cider vinegar with water and Epsom salts and then soaking your feet in it. Apparently if you add apple cider vinegar to the water when you're boiling or poaching eggs, you get firmer egg whites. And you can also use it as a hair rinse, and you're recommended to mix 1 part apple cider vinegar with 1 part water, and then use this as a hair rinse to help detangle your hair. Obviously pour it on, leave it for a couple of minutes and then wash it out. Some people also recommend massaging diluted apple cider vinegar into your scalp to remove dandruff, but there's only anecdotal evidence that that works. Now obviously you try any of these at your own risk, and please do dilute vinegar if you have more sensitive skin because apple cider vinegar is acidic, and there are a lot more apple cider vinegar uses on healthline.com as well. So what did we ultimately make of this cider folklore? Well, I think that the relative lack of cider folklore compared with something like tea fascinates me given the length of time that cider has been popular in Britain. Now, its use as an offering for the fairies makes sense in the Gloucestershire legend. However, I would point out that we should notice it was actually a purchase rather than an offering, and Jones is essentially reneging on a business transaction that was made in good faith. But then in terms of wassailing, which is the mainstay of cider folklore, cider becomes the offering to the spirit of the trees to ensure a good harvest. And here you're using cider itself as part of the transaction to buy more apples to make more cider. So pouring cider on the roots becomes an act of sympathetic magic, and a surprisingly popular one at that. So while it might not have the same legends as beer, or indeed the witchcraft links of wine, cider still becomes a firm part of British folklore. Just remember not to wassail a pear tree by mistake. So I hope that you enjoyed that episode, and I do also hope that you've enjoyed this folklore of drinks theme that we've had going throughout April as well. It's been quite fun to do actually, and I've learned quite a lot of new and interesting things about drinks and whatnot that I didn't really know before, which is one of the beauties of doing this podcast really. In May, we are going to go on and have a look at the folklore of different types of fairies, because as you remember, back in March I asked what people would prefer to learn about, and folklore of drinks came first, and then fairies was the second choice, and witchcraft was the third choice. So I'm essentially doing them in that order. So we will be having a look at different types of fairies in May as well. So if you've got anything specific, then obviously please do let me know, and that'll all be good. So I hope that you enjoyed this week's episode. I hope that you come back next week for the folklore of fairies. So in the meantime, I hope that you have a marvellous week ahead, and I'll see you next week for some folklore around fairies. Cheerio. Well, thanks for listening, and I hope you enjoyed that episode. If you did, feel free to leave a review wherever you listen to podcasts, because that helps other people find the show too. It also takes between 4 and 6 hours to research, write, record and edit these episodes, so if you want to help support my time in doing that, then you can buy me a coffee, or you can join the Fabulous Folklore family on Patreon and enjoy extra benefits, including exclusive episodes and articles and even illustrated talks. All the links you need are below, and thanks in advance.